Okay, so I'm going to try to make this video as short as possible because I've got some things I got to attend to. But I wanted to make a quick video kind of reviewing Garuda Mokka or Mocha. Still, I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it, but this is the Linux distribution that I've been daily driving for between 1 to 2 weeks now. And I have to say, outside of a few issues, which I'll showcase in this video, it has been a remarkable experience. So basically, Garuda is based on Arch Linux. It is an Arch Linux distribution, and it is extremely up to date. I'm not sure. I get the terms confused between bleeding and cutting edge, but it is as up to date as possible. Okay. So in these past days slash week, 2 weeks, however many days it's been, um, I have definitely experienced some very small issues. And to be totally honest, this is my third install of Garuda Mokka, which I'll just call it Garuda Mokka from this point forward, because the first one actually broke on me. Now it broke with user intervention. It was my fault, but it is something that I don't think should have happened. So yes, technically, I'm trying to shift the blame as much away from the OS as possible and put it on my shoulders. It was something that definitely shouldn't have happened though, and it kind of sucked. I actually have a stream up on the channel where you can see it happen in real time. And by the way, I do live stream every single day, or at least I try to, and I'm consistent with it I'd say 95% of the time. So feel free to step in at any time and check those out. We do gaming and Linux streams. I play Zenless Zone Zero, Repo, whatever I'm feeling honestly in the moment. And we just have a chill time and we talk. And if you would like to help my channel grow and you like the Linux content, you want to see more Linux content, you can click the nice shiny buttons below the video title and help my channel grow, and that would be greatly appreciated. But if not, I am so glad that you were here anyway, and I hope that you find this video at least informative in some way, shape, or form, especially if you're thinking about using Garuda or thinking about shifting away from a more stable distribution on older software to something more up to date. Now, here's my story with Garuda. I've used Garuda many times over the years. In particular, it used to be Garuda GNOME. That was my go-to back when I had my uh, GeForce 1650 Super, I believe, or GTX 1650 Super. That card had 4 gigabytes of video memory and was at the time 2021, 2022 still good enough to play basically whatever I wanted to play on it. And Garuda GNOME was the only Linux distribution that ran well on that system. I couldn't tell you why. It just did. That was a system that couldn't even boot Linux Mint, funnily enough. But fast forward, 2024, I have a new computer with an RTX 4060 Ti in it, and I install Garuda Linux on that, specifically Garuda Cinnamon, because in my experience, the Cinnamon desktop environment works the best with NVIDIA cards. And I don't mean better than AMD cards, but I mean out of all Linux distributions I've tested, Cinnamon for some reason just runs really well with minimal desktop lag, animation lag. It just works really well. And that goes for Linux Mint also. It happens in Mint and it happens in Cinnamon. They just both happen to be sharing the same desktop environment. And I think that that honestly has a lot to do with how amazing the experience was. Now, I will say this, um, if I can remember what I was going to say. Cinnamon Smooth. Yes, I covered that. Um, I used Garuda Cinnamon and had an excellent experience. I guess maybe that's where I was going with this. And I had also used Linux Mint. So on that computer, I had mained Garuda Cinnamon and I had mained Linux Mint more than Garuda Cinnamon. But that was only because Garuda Cinnamon is just a little bit too much for my tastes. I think it is simplified version of the Dragonized experience. Still very colorful, but not nearly as cluttered. And I just thought Garuda Dragonized had way too much going on, and it didn't perform well on my NVIDIA GPU. Unfortunately, it had tons of issues, even with Wayland. This is right before the Wayland NVIDIA patches came out in driver 560. So it was just an odd time. So Garuda Cinnamon worked amazingly, but I did have some compatibility issues on that particular PC that I did not have in Linux Mint. And Linux Mint looked more formal. It's based on Ubuntu. I've been using the Ubuntu Debian base basically my entire Linux life, about 13 years now. I've definitely got the most experience with that. And it's just so compatible and so functional that it was really hard for me to turn away from Linux Mint. Until, as that one guy that was really famous in the 2010s said, um, I got my new computer. And Basically, I was distro hopping so bad I was miserable in 2024. I decided to challenge myself to not use a computer for as long as possible outside of when I needed to. So what I did was I sold my 4060 Ti PC. I bought a PlayStation 5 disc edition, and I'm not even joking right now. I used that for between 4 to 6 months consistently, console only, to try to reset my brain because I have OCD, and I'm not going to lie, if anything goes wrong in any particular operating system, I freak out internally and then I distro hop. And fortunately, I'd like to think that I have broken that curse for the most part, but it became a really big problem for me in my life because I wasn't using my computer to do the things I wanted. I was constantly changing and messing with it. So fast forward, like I said, I get my new PC. This is an all AMD PC. So I have a Ryzen 5 7600 6-core 12-thread CPU. We've got an RX 7600 graphics card with 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 video memory, 32 gigabytes of DDR5 clocked at 6400 megahertz, as well as a 1 terabyte Samsung 990 Pro NVMe boot drive. And of course, I've got an additional 3 terabytes of USB SATA 3 storage, SSD storage, and then I've got another 3 terabytes of mechanical storage. So that's my setup. Um, and needless to say, I got this computer, and would you believe it? Windows was absolutely broken for me with Sony games. Now, this is an issue you can find some information about online, but it's honestly not. It's like one of those things that people talk about, but not so much that you can really find useful information regarding the issue. But basically, what happens with my particular graphics card, and I've read reports from other people having the same issue, is in any Sony PC ports, from Marvel Spider-Man 2, Helldivers 2, all the way back around to Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, my computer would shut down. It might take 10 minutes in Spider-Man 2. It might take 30 minutes in Helldivers 2. It might crash in the main menu of Ratchet and Clank, but it would happen every single time. And I didn't know what was going on for like an entire week. I was like, man, I don't have the money to buy another computer. Even if I return this, I really don't. I don't need this. Like, I like the computer. It was working well for literally everything else. I was just freaking out internally. Was not very happy that that was happening, basically. So, of course, I did figure out how to fix it by reading Steam discussions that were very misleading, unfortunately. But there was one person on there that said what the bug was, and the bug is that for some reason, and AMD's known about this for over a year, by the way, they haven't fixed it. For some reason, in Sony titles, if you have an AMD GPU, specific ones, your GPU will try to overclock to above its maximum clock potential, which is around 2900 megahertz for me, something like that. Well, it'll jump to like 2930 megahertz or something like that. Like it'll go right above what it can handle and it shuts down the computer to protect your GPU, which fair enough, at least when it shuts down, it's doing it for a good reason. But the only way to fix that in Windows, from what I could find, is to limit the maximum clock speed your GPU can run at, or cap the in-game frame rate to something that will never run your card at that frequency. So Helldivers 2, I had to run it at 30 FPS, and I don't want to do that. I'd like to play it at above 60. I mean, come on, you know what kind of game it is. It's just something you want to play at the highest frame rate possible. So, needless to say, my next best option I thought was, well, I'll try Linux. Linux has excellent AMD implementation in the kernel for the graphics. Maybe it'll work. And would you believe it? My computer hasn't shut down a single time, and I'm running most of those Sony games at way better frame rates, more consistent frame rates than I ever was in Windows. Thankfully, Linux is not a resource hog in the same way Windows is, especially when it comes to graphics memory consumption. And when you're working with 8 gigabytes, it's kind of important to not be wasting over 2 gigabytes on the desktop. And Windows would literally vor my VRAM. Okay, I would be left with way less video memory for my games than I should have been left with. So it seemed like a win-win. And I was using Linux Mint. I tried Nobara first. I think I was going to use Nobara as my main desktop computer operating system, and I was going to put the Nobara Steam Deck handheld image on my ROG Ally. But Nobara would install, looked great. I was excited. Update, broken. Would not boot into the login screen, could not access a virtual terminal, totally and absolutely unusable, and I could not find a single iota of useful information online for how to fix the problem on AMD GPUs, which is what I have. You could find people that had fixes for NVIDIA with that and Nobara with that particular issue, And I did, just to see if maybe it would fix it for me, try some of those. One of them being that in the grub boot menu, when you're booting into the OS, you can add kernel parameters, and there's one called no mode set that you can throw in there. And I used to have to do that in Linux Mint to get it to boot on particular PCs with NVIDIA cards, but that didn't do anything. The computer was still broken, unfortunately. So I just went to Mint, and I used Linux Mint for probably a week, and I had an amazing time with it until I didn't. Now, my issue with Linux Mint is it's still running Xorg and it is on outdated software. Now, the outdated software is not as big of an issue, generally speaking. Yes, when I say outdated software, I don't mean by too terribly much. The Linux kernel is at 6.8, which is not so far behind like Linux Mint used to be. At least it is more up to date. Um, and I do believe that my Mesa driver was also out of date. I mean, clearly it would have been because it's on an older kernel, but I didn't try to update the kernel or do any of that. That's not something that I like to do with my systems. I've had instability issues in the past with stable distros and then upgrading certain components of them. So that's not something that I was interested in doing. But the main issue was Xorg and the fact that Linux Mint's Wayland session, in my experience on my particular computer, was awful. In particular, totally broke OBS, even for the Xorg session. When I installed OBS in Wayland, it didn't work in the Xwork session. I had to reinstall the application, and I did get it working, but then it would crash, and I wouldn't be able to load into settings, and it had all sorts of issues. Now, that didn't happen when I used Linux Mint only on Xwork and never logged into the Wayland session. So at this point, I'm like, man, I need a Linux distribution that has an up-to-date kernel, totally up-to-date, has an up-to-date Mesa driver, and has Wayland as the display manager out of the box. Something that I know is going to have all the new fixes that make Wayland superior to Xorg. And needless to say, Nobara was going to be that thing for me, but it didn't work. So, next best thing, I've had such an amazing experience with Garuda. 9 out of 10 times that I've used it, it has been amazing. I knew what I had to do. I tried to download Garuda and install it, and it didn't work. Now, as you can see, we're running it, so we eventually figured it out. Fortunately, unlike my issue with Nobara, I was able to find with one simple Google search the fix to this particular issue with Garuda. Now, basically, what happens is you create a Ventoid drive, you download it from its website, you format your bootable drive with it, and then you drag and drop the Garuda Mokka ISO onto that drive. You reboot into the boot menu of your computer, and then you select that drive, the Ventoid drive, and then you boot into Garuda Linux or any other ISO, whether it's Windows, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Garuda Mokka, it doesn't matter. You'll always just click enter and you'll boot in normal mode, and that's what I've always done. But for the first time ever, for some reason with this particular operating system, I had to boot with Grub 2 instead. As soon as I did that, problem solved. Now here's what Garuda has to offer now that I gave you the backstory. And I know I said I was going to try to make this video as short as possible, and I'm trying to, I promise. I just got to give all the context. Garuda gives you an up-to-date Linux kernel, the Zen kernel, which is a customized kernel that is supposed to improve experiences with heavy workloads in a whole suite of different applications, in particular gaming. It has an up-to-date Mesa driver. It has an up-to-date KDE desktop environment, chock full of features, amazing features, the most versatile desktop environment I've ever seen on any OS in my personal experience. And the most important thing for me is that it has Wayland, and it's functional Wayland, and it's smooth Wayland. 95% of the time. There are times where I will notice little bugs here and there. Like you just saw, I pulled up from the bottom of the screen, and the window stuttered for a second. And if you do this, if you make a window full screen, you pull it away, it'll stutter there. Stuff like that. Nothing, not a big deal. Nothing that affects the functionality of the computer, but just little inconsistencies like that are really the majority of the bugs that I've had in this operating system. But it is so good. And whereas Linux Mint, if I was running a game or streaming or doing literally anything that was intensive on the display manager Xorg, it would lag out Xorg. It would run at a much lower frame rate. Just the rendering of my desktop environment and certain games were suffering running on Xorg on my particular hardware. The main one being God of War 2018, which is a game that I love, I hold very near and dear to my heart. And unfortunately, I'm gonna have to like play this video at super low volume or something. Um, I'll just my headphones will literally turn off if it. Okay, so you can't hear it. Good, good, good. Okay. So basically, God of War 2018 would become unplayable basically immediately. And it would drop from like 85 FPS down to 60 at 1080p high with no resolution scaling. And you might say, well, 60 is still playable. And I would agree with you, except for the fact that it was stuttering and like slow motion 60, like terrible frame pacing. It was just awful. And needless to say, that does not happen in Garuda. Matter of fact, I've not had issues streaming and having a million applications open a single time in Garuda. And I'm going to showcase some of that here in just a minute. We're not going to play any games in this video because I plan on making the ultimate gaming Linux video here soon where I test all 80 to 100 games that I have installed across a multitude of game launchers, different setups, things like that. So if that's a video you guys want to see, come back to the channel in the future. I think it's going to be awesome. And you're going to see me load into the launchers. You're going to see which Proton versions I'm using. You're going to see exactly what it could be like if you were to switch to Linux today or to dual boot and start gaming in it. So that's going to be cool. It's going to be quite the undertaking. It's going to take a while to record, but I'm excited for it. So anyway, uh, Wayland is just infinitely better at multitasking than Xorg. And the thing is, Xorg on AMD GPUs already runs better than it does on NVIDIA. So if you can imagine, if you had an NVIDIA GPU, your experience might be even worse in Xorg if you're doing super intensive things. I guess it just depends on the distribution, your particular hardware. For me, it was very functional, but not pleasant. And I don't have that issue in Garuda. Now, we've already talked about most of the positives of Garuda. The gaming performance is amazing. The compatibility is amazing. Where are the bugs then? Like, what are the issues that I'm having? And if I'm going to just lay it out there and hopefully actually chew through this section of the video as fast as possible, basically 90% of the bugs that I've experienced, now I would say 99% of the bugs that I have experienced have been related to KDE, the desktop environment. And you know what's funny about that? I have used a multitude of distributions in the past on Xorg and Wayland with KDE, and KDE always seems to have these very same issues. Odd things, just little things that you might not even notice, but I'm hypersensitive to that stuff, so I typically pick up on it. And I'll show you what I mean. We already talked about how the windows will stutter when doing certain actions. The overview does not render at my monitor's refresh rate. That is not 165 hertz right there. Everything else refreshes at 165 hertz. I could have 15 windows open. They would all perform perfectly at my refresh rate. But when you go to the overview, it does not. I'm pretty sure that this renders at 60 hertz. I mean, that's just what it looks like to me. I was on 60 for so long. It looks like 60 to me. Could be wrong. But that is something to take note of. That is something that I wish rendered at the higher refresh rate. But here's the difference between using Garuda and something like Fedora, which I also tested with Wayland, and Ubuntu with Wayland. Garuda is consistent. If an animation doesn't run at 165 FPS or refresh rate, whatever, then at least it is a consistent 60. So it doesn't bother me visually. Yes, it looks like it's refreshing at a lower frame rate, but it doesn't look bad. And in Fedora and in Ubuntu both, when Wayland would slow down, it would not look very good at all. So it's consistent across the board in Garuda. That's my favorite thing about it. Now, basically only two more things, and I'll tell you how I broke my first install of Garuda. When you open applications that are pinned to your little taskbar down here, it will switch to a different portion for whatever reason of the taskbar. And see, it snapped back. It took it a second. It usually does it immediately. But that happens all the time when launching apps on the left side in particular. I'm not sure what causes that, but once again, it's not something that is actually important, just something that I noticed. And the next thing that was bugging me and that I've had somewhat of an inconsistent experience with is with flat packs, which are not officially supported in Garuda. They don't tell you flat out not to use them. They basically say don't use them unless you need to. And for me, the flat pack of OBS is just the best way to get streaming while being able to sign into my YouTube account without having to use a stream key. The versions that I installed from the software manager Octopi did not have that feature. And we're actually about to get into the how I broke it because it has directly to do with that. But that is one thing I noticed. I've had Windows freeze and break, but I think it might have been because my drive was not doing too good. I've just recently formatted it back to ext4. It was in TFS for a long time, and it was the OS was reacting how I've seen operating systems, even Windows, react when a drive is not healthy or it's not functioning properly, where it will slow things down. It'll freeze open Windows. It'll lock your system up. So I think that that has to do with my drive and not the operating system. But I did want to take note of that. And there's generalized glitchiness in certain things in KDE. But like I said, I've used other distributions with KDE and had the same experience where the icons will jump around, or I've had it happen in such a way before where I couldn't pin them to the taskbar. They would just disappear. But that doesn't bother me nearly as much as the next problem, which is really the only other thing I can think of that's been negative about Garuda. And like I said, I'm pretty sure a KDE thing. I'm like almost 100% sure. But for some reason, when you download a Steam game, it'll ask you if you want to create a desktop shortcut and or a start menu entry. And I always do a desktop shortcut because I like having my games on my desktop. I like the way they look. As you can see, I've got it organized in my weird OCD way. And for some reason, I would say about 85 to 90% of all my Steam games would display with a broken icon. Now, as you can see, they're all working here, and that's for two reasons. One, for some reason, when I rebooted my computer and came back, all the icons were fixed. I'm not sure what causes that. I just chalk it up to early adopter type stuff. We are on cutting/bleeding edge software here, so of course you're going to have some issues like that, especially with KDE being developed so vigorously. But what I ended up actually doing on my previous install before I broke it was just manually downloading icons for all of my games, so you can kind of tell which ones to set custom icons for because they're rounded, and those are typically the icons that you'll find online. But I did want to take note of that. That has been one of the only other things that bugged me. And it doesn't happen with just Steam games. It happens with all sorts of game launchers like Lutris. The EA app here, this is a Lutris installed application, and I had to manually set an icon for this also. So just something to take note of. Not the end of the world. Everything else has been absolutely amazing. Minus one more thing before we get into the breaking of Garuda on my first install. I did notice that when you play Resident Evil 2 in particular, the GOG release that came out last year, for some reason Linux Mint, when you do the ddraw library add to the wine config, the cutscenes play, but they just play in a small window. In Garuda, they don't play at all. For whatever reason, same Proton version, same fix. I'm just going to chalk it up to potentially an encoder, or not an encoder, something that allows the operating system to communicate with that properly. Might have been in Mint that's not here, or maybe it's the desktop environment affecting it. I couldn't tell you specifically, but it doesn't matter to me because I just don't care. Garuda has been so much better for me than Linux Mint personally that I'm willing to sacrifice that. And to be fair, they're not necessarily enjoyable on Linux Mint either because they still don't display properly, but you can at least see them. However, you'll find most people playing the classic Resident Evil trilogy and GOG in Linux are modding their game with RESHDP or the Seamless HD project and replacing the FMVs with higher quality ones that actually work. So anyway, let's talk about how I broke Garuda before we get into our closing thoughts about what I actually consider to just be an amazing operating system. It's I'll gloat about it a little bit here in just a second. So when I did that first install of Garuda, and I'll just show you what I did here. I went to install OBS, and matter of fact, I think I installed it in the initial Garuda setup utility, which this is actually one of Garuda's best features. It's called Garuda Ronnie. It didn't used to look like this, but it is now. Basically, when you install Garuda, it will pull up a window and it'll say you need to update your system, which I think is awesome. I think every distribution should do that automatically. It should literally force you to do it first thing. I just think that that's the best way. And once you update, it will give you a list of applications, like 20 categories with 5 or more apps in every single category, sometimes 10 or more, for basically any piece of software that you could ever want. So I installed my web browser, I installed Octopi, I installed Heroic, or I didn't install Heroic or Lutris. Those came later, which I'll show you in a second. I installed GIMP, Kdenlive, I installed VLC Media Player. I installed a multitude of applications that way, and I think that that is amazing to give users the ability to get the software they need immediately versus having to look through the software manager later And in certain distributions, you have to choose between a system package or a flat pack. And Garuda really makes it simple. And they also make it simple for gaming software, which is what I'll show you now. So once you've done that, it tells you, of course, you need to restart your computer after you update it. So I usually install the software, then I will reboot, come back in, and it's the Garuda Setup Assistant in particular. So you can actually run it again and look at the software if you ever need to. But you open this application, Garuda Ronnie, and look at everything that's here. You've got diagnostics, system maintenance, you can configure your system settings, network utility, you got the setup assistant if you want to go back through it, you've got boot utilities, and you can open up the Garuda Linux start page. Here is the big feature for me though, gaming apps. So if you come over here and you click on that particular icon or this one, gaming, Garuda gives you an interface to install basically everything you could ever need to game in Linux. So of course, I always install Steam Runtime, Heroic Game Launcher, Lutris. Then you've got a bunch of wine utilities. So if you want to install Proton Gloria Segral this way, you could. I prefer Proton up QT and then manually selecting Gloria Segral, but you've got all sorts of goodies here when related to Linux gaming with wine or Proton. You've got gaming tools. So I don't personally install any of these unless I absolutely need to. And the only scenario I could think of for myself personally where I would need to do this is if for some reason my game's not working right. You go to ProtonDB, which I really suggest everybody that's gaming in Linux do. Go to ProtonDB, read the experiences other people are having. You can even sort it by distro and I think by hardware. And sometimes you will find a post on ProtonDB where somebody says use game mode or use DXVK or use Steam Tinker Launch or do this or that or GameScope, stuff like that. And I've never personally needed those applications, but they're here. So if you ever see that on ProtonDB, you can just come back here. You have easy access to it. Not to mention tons of useful utilities like GOverlay, Core Control, Green with Envy if you have an NVIDIA card, Noise Torch. You've got everything here. So many great applications. And then you've got controller drivers. If you need these, say you have the Xbox controller dongle, you've got it. Games, you want to look through all the freeware games that are in the repository for Garuda. You'll find all these games on basically every distribution software manager, but they're here, and you don't have to sort through something like this. Where in Linux Mint, of course, the software manager is a lot prettier. I prefer Octopi because it's simple and I already know what I'm going to install. But this interface kind of bridges that gap. And last but not least, you've got a page full of emulators. That is also amazing. I think that Garuda Ronnie is literally the killer app of Garuda, other than the fact that it's up to date, other than the fact that it's stable for the most part, except for some desktop environment things. It has one of the most user-friendly utilities to install applications that I've ever seen in Linux. And I think that this should be more normalized. And props to the Garuda devs for making this tool. And also props for them not giving us any telemetry questions at all, which is another thing I love about Garuda. It doesn't ask you if you want to share your location. It doesn't ask you if you want to do this or that. It does the same thing Linux Mint does, and I love this about Linux Mint too. There is nothing, zip, no telemetry questions at all, and I think that is absolutely amazing. So now I'll actually tell you how I broke my distro. I boot into Garuda. I try to install OBS in that initial list of software packages that Garuda shows you, and I installed it. I launch it after I've rebooted and installed all my software, and there's no connect to YouTube account option for that version of OBS. So I remembered in the past, a year ago when I used Garuda Cinema, I was like, oh yeah, the same thing happened there. I had to download a special version of OBS, and what it's called is OBS Studio Titan 652. So I'm like, okay, I'll just download that then. And this whole time I'm thinking, well, I could just download the Flatpak, but I couldn't remember if I had done it previously last year on the RTX 4060 Ti PC when I used Garuda or not. So I was like, well, I did at one point install Titan, and I think it solved my issue. I install it. Now, when you install this, and there ain't no way I'm going to go within 100 yards of this ever again, because it did break my system. When I installed this, it changed my FFmpeg version to FFmpeg OBS. Okay, that is important because OBS Studio Titan did not even have the connect to YouTube account option. So at that point, I was like, you know what? I took note of the applications or the packages that were changed. I'm just going to install the Flatpak of OBS. It was as simple as running 3 commands. 3. The command to enable Flatpak, a command to install OBS, and a command to launch it. And by the way, upon rebooting your system, at least for me, OBS, despite the fact that it's not a system package, it's Flatpak, did show up in my installed software in my start menu up here under multimedia, and I was able to pin it to my task manager, I guess that's what they call it here. So that was cool. And OBS, the Flatpak version, does have the connected YouTube account, and it's up to date. It's got everything it needs. Minus, for some reason, this is one of the only other issues I've noticed, and it could be because Garuda is not technically compatible with Flatpaks. I don't have the ability to see my stream chats, nor do I have the ability to see the amount of people on my stream. Now, I think that I could add these at some point manually, but for some reason in Linux Mint, the OBS Flatpak has those. So take note of that. What I decide to do is just not worry about it. I just use the Flatpak of OBS for a few days, and then somewhere along the line a few days ago, or not a few days ago at this point, it's been well over a week, but a few days into using it on my very first install, I decided that I wanted to try to get Wallpaper Engine working because I like Wallpaper Engine. I've had it for years. I've used it for years. And I know that for a long time, you could get it to work on KDE. So that's what I try to do. I went through all the steps to get it to work, and I almost got it to work until there was an error message displaying where my Wallpaper Engine wallpaper should have been. And when I looked it up, would you believe that people were saying that the same issue happened to them when they switched from FFmpeg to FFmpeg OBS? And the solution that worked for them was reverting back to FFmpeg. Now, here's where things get a little dicey. I tried to do that. Remember, I'll just look up FFmpeg right here. What I decided to do was, okay, I will just install FFmpeg, and I will uninstall FFmpeg OBS. Well, I must have accidentally clicked FFmpeg full and marked it for installation. So when I went to click the little apply button up here, it said FFmpeg full. I was like, okay, no, I don't want to do that. So I clicked cancel. And then I right-clicked on FFmpeg, clicked install, clicked apply, and then it installed FFmpeg full anyway. Now, I didn't want FFmpeg full. I never even wanted FFmpeg OBS. But this is where the story takes a really dark turn. I go to switch from full to the standard because that's what people said was working for them with Wallpaper Engine. And if you notice something here, and you'll see this as a general rule of thumb for Arch distributions like this, they tell you don't install packages from the AUR. You're going to break your system. Well, that is exactly what happened. When I went to switch back to standard FFmpeg from FFmpeg full, it literally deleted my entire desktop environment. Everything broke. The only thing that was working were applications that I already had working. I had to thank God I had a terminal open. I had to legitimately use my web browser, download Ventoy, use the terminal to extract that package, make the Ventoy web interface launchable, open up my web browser, download Garuda Mokka, another ISO, so that I could try it again, reinstall, because at this point, the system was so far gone that I didn't even see a point in fixing it. I had all of my games on other drives anyway. The few that I didn't know, I started copying, and then I had to copy that ISO from my download folder to that Ventoy drive, and I had to start fresh. It just broke the entire system. So I've made it a rule of thumb, and I would recommend to any of you guys out there that are working with a distribution like this, be very, very careful. Don't misclick. It could be catastrophic. So I reinstalled Garuda Mokka. Have I been calling it Mokka or Mokka? I don't even know. Reinstall it. Everything's fine, but now I have this cloud hanging over my head. I'm like, man, I'm kind of scared to use it. Like, I've been using Linux for 13 years. I never saw anything like that ever, except for when Linus Tech Tips installed Steam on Pop! OS, and it deleted his desktop environment. So I decided that night, I was like, you know what? Even if Mint has these problems, I would much rather feel safe knowing I'm not going to destroy my computer versus all the good things that Garuda offers me. I switched back to Linux Mint, immediately regretted it because it immediately started slowing down and having issues. And I immediately switched back, and here we are. I haven't touched it. I haven't installed any AUR packages. I'm just using my computer and everything has worked out. Yes, it's annoying, the glitchiness with KDE. Yes, it's annoying that my desktop icons for Steam games and other launchers do not display properly unless system rebooting. And even after I rebooted, some of them broke again. But I've accepted it as early adopter type thing. I am on super up to date software. I kind of expected certain things like that not to work properly. I mean, to be fair, I've used KDE in the past and had similar issues. So it's weird, but it's great. It is a great operating system. It works so well. I would recommend Garuda Mokka to literally anybody that's looking for an up-to-date Linux distribution to switch from another distro off of. It's beautiful. Everything about it is beautiful. It's not like Garuda Dragon Eyes where it feels like too much. This feels like the proper amount of aesthetics mixed with super up-to-date software, great functionality, and generally great stability. Great gaming performance. I mean, you wouldn't believe the things I've accomplished in Garuda that I couldn't do in Windows 11, like, or even in Linux Mint. And a lot of that has to do with ZRAM. Garuda has ZRAM out of the box. And what ZRAM does is instead of using a swap file or a swap partition on your drive, it compresses memory overload back into memory and decompresses it when it's needed. And it is so fast. I could have 30 browser tabs open. I could have 25 applications displaying on my desktop, and I could still access the overview, and it would run at the same frame rate that it has. Nothing else would be slowing down, and I could be playing a game at 1080p high settings, even newer games, without losing any performance. And I've just never had that experience on any other operating system. Something about Garuda just really gets right, especially on AMD hardware, and I absolutely love it. Now, I will say the only time I've noticed slowdown when playing a game, even if I didn't have a lot of windows open or tabs, is for some reason Resident Evil Village. When I tab out of that, my desktop exhibits some slowdown, but it's not like it doesn't affect anything. I just notice it visually. That's the only time it's ever happened. I mean, I've played everything from Escape from Tarkov, all of my Steam games. Like, let me just show you all the games that I have installed really quick before we end the video. We've got, well, I'm on the wrong Steam account. We've got a lot of games in Steam. I think we've got over 80. We open up Heroic here. You can see what we have installed: Alan Wake 2, Control, Cyberpunk, Final Fantasy 7, Ghost Runner 2, Mortal Shell. Come over here, open Lutris, and then Lutris is where we have Escape from Tarkov. We've got the EA app. We have Battle.net. The EA app, I have Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Fallen Order installed, two games that I love very dearly. We've got Diablo installed to Lutris because the heroic version didn't work right without some user intervention. I couldn't really find a great source for that online. For some reason, Lutris is not launching. I promise this is not an indication to the operating system being bad. We'll just quit. Oh, okay. To be fair, I did system update earlier, as I mentioned earlier in the video. That might be what it is, so I'm not worried about it. Needless to say, we have games installed in there, but I've never had a single issue with Lutris. But I did system update, so maybe it updated some packages that has to do with that, and it just needs to be rebooted. But we have lots of lots of games, plural, not singular. Everything has worked flawlessly, except for GTA San Andreas the Definitive Edition, which was already a buggy mess. I did have some problems with that, but here's what I'll say in closing. I can't say for certain that I will never switch to another Linux distribution. I can't say that in the future, if I needed it for some reason, I wouldn't use Windows. I mean, my ROG Ally has Windows on it. That is kind of my excuse to not have to dedicate my full PC to using Windows at all in any capacity. But what I will say is that this has been the best experience I've ever had in Linux outside of Linux Mint on my 4060 Ti PC. And it really just goes to show you how far Linux has come. I mean, day one, I was able to play AI Limit, the first Berserker Kazan. Stalker 2 runs better in Linux than it ever did on any other distribution or even in Windows. Windows was actually really bad. Everything, and I'm streaming at the highest bitrate YouTube Sports, 10,000 kbps, and it doesn't flinch. It is so perfect, everything about it. And I love little details, by the way, of KDE, and you're not going to find this exclusive to Garuda, but being able to see like photos that I have on my desktop in folders as icons, little things like that, not to mention the context menu is absolutely insane. It's just so packed with features, excellent features. It is mostly stable. It has delivered the best gaming experience I've ever had on this computer, and it's got all the things that you want in a Linux distribution, minus the bad things that you would find in, say, Ubuntu or maybe the direction that Fedora is heading in, amongst other distributions. And I am kind of surprised that more people recommend against Garuda, but I will say that at least a lot of these people are coming from the perspective that they don't want you to break your computer. And that is definitely a possibility if you use this operating system. You have to be careful with managing packages. You might break your entire operating system, and then fixing that's going to be a real pain. So just be very careful. And as long as you compute smartly, you know, get on forums. If you need help, comment on this video. Get on one of my live streams if you ever need help with something. Before you do anything that you think could affect you in a negative way in this operating system, ask somebody. And just remember, you're never going to find any Linux elitism garbage on this channel. I'm here to help people find another path from Windows. That is what I want. I want to show people that there's another way, and there's a great way. And you can do everything that you would want to do with minimal sacrifices needing to be made most of the time. And that way is just Linux. It's just amazing. Garuda Mokka in particular is an amazing distribution. Everything about it's awesome. So yeah, I don't really know what else to say. I think I said my piece. I'm sorry the video wasn't shorter. I really wanted it to be. Um, it's awesome, and I hope that you guys found this informative. If you were thinking about switching to Garuda Mokka, I hope that this helped you make your mind up on it. I can't say enough good things about it, and I only have a few bad things to say about it. So it really, really goes to show you the quality of this overall. It's just insane. So if you did like this video, be sure to come check out my live streams. I go live every day. Like I said, if you ever have any questions, feel free to drop in the live stream and ask, or leave a comment on the video. I am so small at this point with my channel that I have actually got the ability to respond to all comments. So I will always try my best to do that, to be as helpful to you guys as possible. And yeah, I mean, I think I already said at the beginning, if you want to help my channel grow, you can click the buttons below the video title. I'm not going to say that again, even though I just kind of did. But yeah, I don't know. It's been your friend No Viewers, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.